Maurice Hilleman is the salt of the earth. The frontier mentality, growing up in a rural part of Montana. I mean, that's about as good as it gets when you talk about the frontier spirit.
That was the luckiest thing that could happen to anyone, to be born on a farm on the western frontier, because you were really became a workaholic. You did survive. You learned respect. You learned something about industry, plants, nursery stock, and so forth. And these were really a crucible for learning background for science.
The odds of his becoming an internationally prominent superstar in medicine, having accomplished what he did, is infinitesimal.
It's hard to imagine, isn't it? This man who grew up in Custer County, Montana in the early 1900s, becoming, if not the most, certainly one of the most prolific scientists of our time, certainly the scientist who saved more lives than any other.
The aspiration at that time was get a job at JCPenney's, and if things really go good, maybe you could become the manager, and look at that now, it's almost ludicrous.
Life is a series of chance opportunities. My even getting to college at all was a most unusual chance thing. It just happened. I went off to the University of Chicago, and I really wanted to be a medical doctor, but I never had the money to be able to go ahead into medicine. So you're constantly making choices. It can take you down many paths, but you have to seize your opportunities as you see them.
Life was pretty rough when he was in Chicago, and then he married Thelma.
Thelma was from Miles City, Montana, and probably a very similar background. They weren't able to conceive a child, so they decided to adopt. They told me I was adopted. I remember reading a book called The Adoptive Family, and they were just very matter-of-fact and open about my being adopted.
Everything was going great, and then Thelma got sick a few years later with breast cancer.
And Dad didn't really share a lot of his deep feelings, things that were hard for him. He would share stories from the past and so forth, but we would never have a conversation like what it felt like to lose Thelma when she died. I know he honored her in many ways, and one of the things that my sister and I remember fondly from growing up was going out to visit her grave in a beautiful park-like setting. There was a pond nearby, and even visiting her, though, became very much of a science outing.
We would take our butterfly nets in our jars of acetone and formaldehyde, and we'd head to the graveyard. And it was kind of a fun afternoon. And we'd chase the butterflies around. And we always visited Thelma's grave, but the real purpose for going was much more scientific.
Very professorial, but he wanted everybody to learn science and love science.
Maurice was a wonderful father to the children. He asked permission to ask me out, so I didn't know what to say when he asked me, so I told him yes, he could. And then on that night when he brought me home, he kissed my hand. Very, very gallant, I thought, and he couldn't have been more of a gentleman, very nice. 3 months later, we were married.
When he was in town, if he wasn't traveling, he would come home by 5 o'clock every night. He'd read the newspaper. We always had dinner together. He talked about work a lot at dinner.
He would either tell us something that happened during the day, and I became very conversant in words like poly-IC and interferon and things that most young children have no clue about, and understand the drug approval process and what goes on in the Bureau of Biologicals, as it was then called, and the FDA. So that was a standard for dinner time conversation.
But after dinner was over, I used to climb into his lap when I was still small enough to fit in his lap, and he would tell me grandpa stories.
Those were some of my favorite. He would talk very lovingly of his father, Bob, and also of his grandfather, Adolf.
He was very sweet as a daddy growing up. The soft side of him, I think probably the sweetest, softest side of him was that he came into our rooms, my sister's in my room, every night, and he sang us to sleep at night. And he had a whole repertoire of things he would sing. But his favorite song was Edelweiss. And he would sing that to us every night.
The soft side is really what I knew growing up of my dad. He was not a strict disciplinarian. He was a very loving father who would react to some of my antics with amusement and love. And I really don't remember my father punishing me. He taught me a lot more by example and by setting expectations. But he was not a tough taskmaster. So as I was older and I met more of his colleagues and learned that he was viewed as being tough, it was more entertaining to me because I felt I knew the real Maurice. I think it works sometimes. My dad could be gruff. He was fiercely loyal to the people that worked well with him, but he didn't, as they say, didn't tolerate fools lightly.
He liked to describe his process as being a bit of a dictator.
He was a tough person. He wasn't a person who will take no for an answer.
He was definitely homegrown, definitely different, definitely strongly opinionated, definitely was not afraid to be strongly opinionated and to express himself forcefully.
He didn't have time for politics, posturing, self-aggrandizement, all of those attributes that sometimes people showed he really didn't have much patience with.
I think his gruffness was a way of promoting the practicality and the pragmatism that he thought was important.
Having seen his impatience for things like standing in line in the cafeteria, he would just bypass the line and go behind the counter and scoop out a bowl of chili or help himself to a bowl of soup.
When he would drive up to the building at Merck, there was a parking lot around the back, and it took too much time to go around to the back for the parking lot. So he would park right in front of the building, and there was really no amount of reasoning that Merck could do with him to get him to change that. He got to work, he got in the door, and that was how he operated.
So nobody was going to get in his way and nobody was going to stop him. So I think if you can eliminate that as an obstacle, you can achieve great things.
Max Tischler was de facto Maurice Hilleman's boss. He, like Maurice, had grown up in difficult circumstances. He was, like Maurice, a self-made man, and he was, like Maurice, a very dominant and willful individual. But when they butted heads, which was occasionally, it was invariably Maurice who came out on top.
Max told me one day, he said, you know, people come into my office and they end up shaking. He said, your husband comes into my office and I end up shaking, which I said tells you a little bit about Maurice and how strong he could be about certain things.
Not because he was a nasty guy, not because he was an impolite guy, but he was a driven guy. And he was a tough guy. I mean, he knew, here is the task, we're going to go and get it.
He was not a person who tried to be politically correct in any way. My dad was really a man of simple tastes, and he liked very basic food. There were certain things that he loved to make, anything with apples in it, black-eyed peas, Slickers.
He liked chicken pot pie, chicken and dumplings, simple food. Home food, you know, comfort food.
And of course, the crowning idiosyncrasy was ketchup.
Maurice loved ketchup, and he put it on just about everything he was eating, on all kinds of burgers, on hot dogs, on macaroni and cheese, you name it, he put it on there. And he used it too much.
Everything had to have ketchup on it. And I think he did it partly because he loved ketchup, but partly because he loved the effect.
Lorraine invited me to dinner in Philadelphia at this fancy, small Italian restaurant that has about 6 seats or 8 seats, and you can't get in, and they get a table, we go in.
And he would order ketchup. Oh, I would die sometimes.
You can imagine what the Italian waiter was looking at him with dark, harsh eyes. You want ketchup on our food? You know, yes, of course. God damn it, I need that ketchup. You know, they had to go find ketchup somewhere.
Vacations were almost non-existent, but he would, once in a while, we'd get him to do something.
Once a year, we would go to Cape Cod for maybe 5 days. I don't think it was a full week.
He had a rhythm of how he worked that really guided him in his daily routine. He immersed himself in the science, and when there was a break from that, I think he felt he had to catch up and reestablish that. So he really wasn't very keen on going on vacations.
Living with Maurice was, well, it was a journey, let me say. And there were ups and downs, of course, as in every marriage, but he was a wonderful father, he was a wonderful husband, and he was a very kind person. A lot of people would think he wasn't kind at all, but he was really a very kind person.
He had that bluff exterior, but he was a very warm, personable man. And that had an impact upon the way he was able to develop new vaccines.
He also liked getting out there and speaking with people. When he went to a meeting, people would come up and just want to tap his brain. And I think he liked that. I think he liked speaking with younger scientists. I think he liked answering their questions.
He had every paper he had ever published, and there were hundreds of them, in these bound sort of folders which were indexed so that you had this ability to completely see all of his work.
He could really synthesize vast troves of information down to a simplistic, understandable, concise article.
It was a chance to educate others about what he had learned. I mean, he had the green thumb for making vaccines, and I think he wanted to be able to pass that on to those who followed him. When Maurice was basically on his deathbed, I asked him if he had any regrets. And one of the regrets was that he hadn't done more. He'd made vaccines to prevent 9 different diseases. I mean, that's logarithmically more than anyone had ever done before him. But to him, it wasn't enough.
He really was humble. He liked to let other people have the limelight. He was willing to share. He didn't go out of his way to make sure he was the one that was noted and part of it. He was really focused much more on the accomplishment. And when there were moments when he was recognized for his accomplishments, I think he was deeply appreciative. It meant a lot to him, but he didn't go out of his way to promote himself or seek that recognition.
I don't think it mattered one bit the degree to which Maurice was recognized by the public to him. I think what mattered to him was that children's lives were better and longer and healthier. That's all that mattered to him. I mean, his devotion to children, his interest in making one vaccine after the next, to the point that it was still never enough, was all Maurice cared about.
Looking back on one's lifetime, you say, gee, what have I done? Have I done enough for the world to justify having been here? You know, that's a big worry to people from Montana, at least.
The world should be better for you having been in it, he always said. And everybody should make some kind of contribution, no matter how small.
There's a great joy in being useful. And that's the satisfaction that you get out of it. Other than that, it's the quest of science and winning a battle over these damn bugs, you know? That's the scientists' war, and when there's a spin-off to help mankind, fine, I like that.